Give it a couple more minutes, let people get settled. I think someone's still connecting to audio. Rishi, you look so cozy. Is that tea you have?
It's one of the advantages of not being there in person. Right. I think the next thing is I need to get a screen with a fire flickering in the background.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially for the winter months as we get into the winter.
That's a really good idea.
Very nice. So hopefully everybody had a chance to read at least one of the stories. I think we linked to both of them in the event on our calendar. So if you haven't, then after this event tonight, hopefully you'll have a chance to read them both. They're both fantastic. I enjoyed them greatly. All right, so let's get started. Let's see. So welcome to tonight's program, One City, One Story author panel with Chandraya Lahiri and Rishi Reddy. My name is Amy Lousteau, and I'm the Community Outreach Librarian here at the Belmont Public Library. Thank you all for being here, and to the Friends of the Library for helping make this event possible. I invite you all to get in touch with me with any questions or program ideas, and I'll put my email address and phone number in the chat in just a minute. We'll also have a feedback survey. I'll put that link in the chat as well now and at the end of the event. And just to note that we are recording tonight's session. We'll have some time for Q&A throughout, so you can put your questions in the chat as they occur to you or save them for later. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Chandraya Lahiri. Her short fiction has been published as public literature after winning contests like the Boston One City, One Story and Boston in 100 Words contests. She is also a storyteller in the tradition of the Moth and has won a Moth Story Slam and appeared on national shows like Stories from the Stage and Suitcase Stories. She has been featured on a few podcasts and been an invited teller on regional shows. She curates a slam series, produces a storytelling show, and runs virtual flash fiction groups when she can. Chandreyee has a collection of short fiction, memoir, and children's literature, which she hopes to publish. Born in Kolkata, India, Chandreyee grew up, lost my place. Chandreyee grew up in Africa and the Middle East and works in environmental management for the state of Massachusetts. And our other panelist, Rishi Reddy, is the author of the novel Passage West, a Los Angeles Times Best California Book of 2020, and a finalist for the New England Book Award. Set in California's Imperial Valley at the onset of World War I, it tells the tale of two Punjabi sharecroppers, their Mexican sweethearts, Japanese neighbors, and Anglo friends at a time of rising xenophobia. Rishi's previous work of fiction, Karma and Other Stories, received the 2008 L.L. Winship/Penn New England Award for Fiction. Stories from that collection were selected for Best American Short Stories, aired on National Public Radio, received honorable mention for the Pushcart Prize, and chosen for Boston's 2013 One City, One Story Community Read. Rishi was born in Hyderabad, India, and grew up in the United Kingdom in the United States. She lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So please help me welcome Rishi and Chandreyee. Thank you both for being here. So I think we're going to start with Chandreyee reading from her story, Dumbachora. Is that right?
Sure. I think I'd like to introduce the story first, if that's okay.
Please do.
So Dumbachora is the name of my short story. This is what it is. You can find the booklets in many places in the Greater Boston area. It's also online. It is set in the Sundarban area, which is a vast mangrove ecosystem in the delta of the River Ganges in the Bay of Bengal. And it's an area that's under a lot of environmental stress. There's a war between culture and changing climate, and there's a lot of change. There's a lot of poverty. It's also one of the most incredibly beautiful areas, and it's very unique. It's a land of dense mangrove forests that are populated by the Royal Bengal tiger. There are crocodiles and sharks in the water. There are the whole area is full of these hundreds and hundreds of little islands and fishermen and farmers who eke out a living. So my story is set in this area, and there's a couple, a newly married couple. The husband is named Shekhar and the wife is named Shutapa, and they are on a trip in the Sundarban area on the river when the tide recedes and their boat gets stuck on a sandbar and the sun is setting. So I'm going to start reading. I'm going to read a short excerpt where their boat is stuck on a sandbar and they're both on top of the boat and they're just waiting eventually for the tide to come in and free them. And there's a boatman on their boat, and that's all there is, the three of them. Is honesty as overrated as the cynics claim? Shutapa asked, breaking the silence that had settled on the boat this past half hour. Until she spoke, the occasional call of a bird from the jungle was the only sound that interrupted the intermittent whistling of a chill evening breeze. Meaning? Asked Shekhar, startled out of his reverie. His attention had been dreamily shifting between the beauty of the newly descended dusk and Shutapa's profile. Specifically, that one long curl of black hair that snaked past her ear, a golden hoop threaded delicately through its smallish lobe. If I share something with you, would you promise to listen with an open mind? She asked in a rush. Of course, replied Shekhar, wariness mingled with his curiosity. Oh, I'm so sorry. I think I'm reading the wrong section, but never mind. His new bride had remained as much a stranger 3 months after their wedding as she was just before it when they'd first met. Brought together by the relentless combined forces of parental zeal and tradition, they had let themselves be swept away by an arranged marriage. Shekhar was surprised that the idea was not abhorrent to him, even if it was not quite what he had envisioned for himself. Kolkata in the 1990s had transformed in this area now, and alliances orchestrated by families included a degree of wooing and the right of refusal. Still, the model never sat well with him, and it let off a faint whiff of personal failure. I'm going to move on a little ahead because I think I started reading the wrong part. So they have a little bit of a standoff, and she tells him that I had a boyfriend before. Did you know that? And he says, I do know. His name was Manoj Bagchi. He could not stand up to his Brahmin family's caste bias against you. And then there was silence. So this is the part I'm meant to read. I'm so sorry. A low, loud, whooping beat punctured the silence that had sunk between them, weighted by confession and the poundage of their entire future. It came from a luminous white heron gliding a lazy path across their view of the jungle as it headed towards the horizon, just about where the sun had finally sunk. Shekhar silently tracked its flight. You knew and still agreed to this arranged marriage? She asked softly. We all have pasts, Shutapa. They can be hard to leave behind. That's the reason I have not tried to get intimate with you these past 3 months that we've been married. These things take time, said Shekhar in a carefully measured voice, his back still turned to her. Same old story then, isn't it? Her voice was now strong and challenging, her gaze clear again, unmarred by the sudden tears that she angrily brushed away. She did not mean to apologize or slip into a martyr's meek shoes just because she was a woman who had dared to follow her heart. I didn't have you down as a conservative hypocrite, Shekhar. One set of rules for men and another for women. By loving once, even if it was a mistake, I have given up all rights of loving you, right? Right? She flared up, defiance back in full measure as she violently yanked his arm from behind to turn him around. She would make him face her and their life. The unexpected force and Shekhar's precarious perch on the boat's prow proved unequal to his balance. He windmilled his arms a few times in search of it, then silently toppled over the side of the boat and disappeared. And that's where we're going to end.
Thank you so much. So if people have questions about that, you can feel free to unmute or type in the chat. And I'll start off with one, which is, what do you see as the crux of the misunderstanding between Shekhar and Sutapa when Shekhar falls into the water?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things was, I think Shekhar, it turns out, had not been intimate with his brand new wife, whom he had gotten married in a kind of orchestrated way. He had not gotten in touch, gotten close to her because he thought that she might still be kind of hurting for her old lover, who actually could not stand up to his parents, who were very traditional, and he couldn't marry her. And he thought he was just giving her some space. She, on the other hand, misunderstood him keeping a distance as being just the stereotypical chauvinistic attitude of some regressive pockets or some traditional pockets of society where people did not believe that women were allowed to have a past. This is the way traditional society used to be. So I think it's a classic tale of misunderstanding and miscommunication. It's also everything is changing around them. Arranged marriages have long ceased to be the regressive, very blind kind of thing that they used to be in old Bengali society. But as these changes happen, as these changes ripple through our culture, people are kind of thrown off balance. So the first part I read by mistake, I think I read where Shekhar had an arranged marriage, but he was surprised that he didn't object to it. He considers himself modern. I'm not gonna have my parents set me up with some girl. Yet he hadn't found someone, he was lonely, he got introduced to someone and he really liked her. And he's not quite sure how he feels about it. So I think that misunderstanding was a typical communication problem, as well as two people trying to negotiate the shifting sands of change. She trying to stand up to her rights as a woman who still she had a partially arranged marriage. So she's in a conservative bubble, but trying to stand up for himself. He's trying to make sense of this new relationship and give her space. And they get it all so wrong.
If I may just interject, a dear friend of mine is Indian, and years ago, before she met her now husband, she had said to me in a moment of frustration, she was like, I'm just going to have my parents set me up. I reminded her of that years later. She was like, I never said that. But I feel that tension among the younger generation for sure. Okay, so there was a question in the chat, but the person thinks that that you answered it with that. So thank you. About, yielding to an arranged marriage, even though, feeling this tension between modern and old-fashioned, perhaps.
I have a question for you, Chandreyee. Why do you think that Sutapa chose this moment to reveal, her heart, like, what's happened to her in the past and now? When I read this story, I thought that's very interesting that this is the moment that's chosen.
Yeah. I mean, Rishi, your guess is as good as mine because this is a short story and not a novel. I don't have the entire histories mapped out in my head. But personally, what I think is she had enough. I don't know if I say it anywhere in the story, but I think they might have been married for maybe 3 or 4 months. And this might possibly be their first honeymoon trip where they're away from the family. And I think she's kind of really sick of being rejected because he's not being intimate with her. And the only way you can take it when you're feeling attracted to someone enough that you actually married them is I think she's trying to figure out what is wrong. he looks like, even in the excerpt I read, he's staring at her. He's obviously besotted with her, that he won't touch her. There's distance. They're awkward with each other. I think she just took the bulls by the horn, because there they were on this romantic thing. And she's just like, oh, enough already. What is the problem? And she thought, okay, maybe this is why I think he's doing it. Let me just come out with it. And it all came out. That's what I think. But really, anybody's guess is as good as mine. But thank you for asking.
I had a thought about that, actually. It sort of reminded me of when you were little and you had a sleepover and sort of all the confessional stuff that comes out.
Yes.
At nighttime, there's like the cover of night, and it's just easier to talk when you can't see everybody, fully.
Yeah.
I
I want to say too that there's a moment in Rishi's story. I know I'm kind of crossing over, but in Karma, there's one line that just sang to me the first time I read it, and when I reread it, where the husband and the wife who've been married for a while, the wife says, sometimes I get scared about, sometimes you scare me. And he says, why? And she says, because you're angry and you never used to be angry. And to me, it was such a stunning moment, because they've been together for a while, and you can still be learning things about each other, especially when circumstances change and you're under pressure. And that's kind of the flip side of it for me, that my story, we're talking about the beginning of a marriage where they're just trying to figure each other out and they're so far apart. In Rishi's story, in some ways, they're negotiating one of the toughest things in their life. And there's a bit of that, I thought I knew you, right? Does that make sense, Rishi?
Yeah, that's very interesting, Chandreyee. What I thought of that moment, that's very interesting parallel you're drawing. What I thought of that moment when I read it in your piece was, and maybe this is like too, I'm just looking at this in too much of a literature kind of way, but it's like when you leave society behind and you're out in the wild, you can leave society's traditions and strictures behind too. And so, they were actually allowed in the jungle to speak from their heart in a way that you can't when you're in the hierarchy of society, when you're in like the traditional structure of society. So that's why I thought definitely, what both you and Amy said for sure about she was sick of,
So it's interesting. There's someone in the audience who said the exact same thing. She's writing, Krishna Kuli is writing, also they are out in the wild away from Kolkata. It lets you be free. Isn't that what you're saying?
Yeah, yes, for sure.
I'm sure you're right.
So,
when you're so distracted by life, or like you're saying, feeling like you're operating within the boundaries of society, you can't quite break free. I bet you're right. See, like I said, I love this. Such as much the reader's story as mine. And I think you're right. I agree with you and Krishna Kuli.
yeah.
I think you're right.
I was just going to say that I found the part in Karma that you were referring to, Chandreyee.
Yeah.
She says, sometimes you scare me. And he says, because I'm a failure. And she says, because you are angry. You were never angry in India. So
That's exactly the part. And I thought it's not a parallel with my story per se, because they're two different people. They're four different people and there's two different marriages, but it struck me how I think Rishi and I were talking about this one day, that it's about the love that you want to give and the love that you want to receive. And to me, it always feels like we speak a different language, and to try and get the other person to understand us, it's like learning a whole new skill set. And in Karma, which was Rishi's story, and I know I think we should get to that next, that visited a very different moment in their lives when they were negotiating a whole different kind of hurdle. Like there again, he's so defensive because he thinks he's a failure, and he feels like she must be so disappointed in me, and her disappointment may not be because of the failure. She's just thrown off by the fact that, who are you? Why are you behaving in this unexpected way? But if maybe we could move on to Rishi's story, because I thought that was very interesting.
Thank you, Chandreyee. I'll read from it. I just want to add one piece here about, we often have these debates about, quote, in what in India are called love marriages, and the tension and the dichotomy of the love marriage versus the arranged marriage, as if there is a dichotomy. But in fact, what they are is whatever the circumstance is that allows one to open themselves up emotionally to another person. And, within the culture, it's the ability to say, oh, this is the person who somehow arrived on my doorstep, or, where I suddenly feel like they are special enough or whatever to have that stepping forward to somebody. And we call that in different cultures, the arranged marriage or the love marriage. But I've always, growing up here in the United States and having that, of course, tension all the time, in the era of my teens and 20s and even 30s, like, that is the thing that we're grappling with all the time, is how do you reconcile these two really different notions of culture and love? And then, go into an exploration of what are we promoting in societal structure through each of these ways of marrying. This is sort of the tension I always felt when I was.
No, I
anyway,
agree. And what makes it even more fascinating to me is all of this changes. I mean, I came to America from India 25, 26 years ago, and the cultures I'm writing about, I don't think it exists in the same way that I remember it, because the culture has moved on and I'm in touch with the culture, but I live here now. So from what I hear and gather from people around me, that the kind of marriage that they have is way more common. I had that kind of marriage. My husband and I were introduced by our families because they're related. We had one of these partially arranged. It's really no different than meeting at church in the 60s in America, right? Someone introduced, or meeting somebody at a party. It just happens to be that your parents threw you together. And I think all of that is changing, which is why I was really happy to write that into Shekhar's persona.
Yes.
That he never thought this would happen. He's a modern guy. He probably cracked 50 jokes about his parents setting him up. Yeah, right. It's like what Amy was saying, right? When your friend was like, we don't even dream it'll happen yet. Oh my gosh, here you are. How embarrassing that I like the girl that my parents picked out for me. It's there's a lot of confusion around it. And I know when Priya, who's watching, said something about how it's super awkward for the guy too. The movies will show us this blushing woman, and there's so much feminist outrage, is what she says, because the guy comes to see the girl and the woman seems to have no agency, right? But it's really awkward for the guy too. So yeah, there are the different ways that marriage can be formed. There's the shifting sands of what arranged marriage even means and what a love marriage even means. And on top of everything else, I feel like is a whole different conversation is the outcomes. Like, I know my parents had an arranged marriage, and I find it fascinating that when people get married and then fall in love, which is what happened in the old-fashioned arranged marriages, the outcomes of those marriages are not necessarily any worse than if you fell in love first, because in some ways the bars are set differently. People don't expect perfection. They don't expect a Mills and Boons romance. They kind of accept the person as their husband or as their spouse, and then set about falling in love almost on purpose. So it's a very interesting, the whole thing of marriage is super interesting. But I think it would be great to, could we hear from Rishi's story, and maybe if Rishi could introduce it?
Yeah, for sure. Did Priya have a question? I think Priya, you had your hand raised for a moment.
I didn't have a question. I was just making an observation. So, when Chandreyee was talking about, well, she was reading out my observation. I was thinking that back in the 90s, when I was in my 20s and going through the whole marriage thing, I remember my friends and I used to say that, okay, we'll be put on display. So that's the, the groom's family visiting and stuff to see the bride. And it was, we used to think of it as a humiliating experience for us, being educated women and stuff, but it's not fun for either party. Yeah, basically that's just what I wanted to say. It's awkward, it's uncomfortable, but but things have changed. It's like, meeting up on a first date, set up by a dating agency or something like that. Yeah. So yeah, that's it. Yeah.
And I think we had one more question from Mita, if you still have your question. I think you're muted.
Hi, I just didn't want to hold back. We would like to go to Rishi's story, but just two quick things that are among all this conversation, a little excerpt. Like personally, I think like, many of the men and women also, like, on the other side, think we are modern, but when actually the practicality comes, we're not as modern as we would love to be. So that things happen, like, sometimes we say yes, like with Shutopa's, having an ex-boyfriend, like it's okay that, I'm a modern guy, I accept it. But in reality, when, you see, I don't know, like I feel there may be something that Shekhar had that, just held him back because, however modern he thought and others would perceive, he's probably not, and he probably not good, but, get past that. But on the other hand, yes, like he was giving some time, so it was misinterpreted that way also. But in general, I was thinking, and quickly, like in the wild thing, like they found a space and a bandwidth or whatever to actually express, like Shutopa telling her own story. I think if in the wild also, if they to me, like if they were having fun, or it was like a normal like boat ride, even if in the wild or something, probably it would not have come out as now, because it's sort of some sort of like desperation. I don't know, like like the tide will go, what will happen? Is it the uncertainty that also kind of like, let me just say it now, like if not now then never, kind of a thing, like it's kind of like they're stuck. They just don't know.
That's
Yeah.
a great observation. I'm sure that's it. The other thing that also stuck me is being stuck between land and water, but
Right.
between the sky and water. Did that put them in some kind of a
Like,
suspended,
okay. Yeah.
For
like you're
sure.
saying, uncertainty? Nothing is sure. It's now or
Yeah.
never,
So
all bets were off.
that sort of things. And about the arranged marriage, like here now, quite a few friends of mine got arranged marriage in a different way in America. So I think things are shifting. They are going in one way, we are going other way. Whatever suits our time, career, we are going that way. So it's always like, can weigh in. Okay, that's all. I just wanted to say something.
Thank you, Mita. I also wanted to add to the dynamic of the couple is that they, for anybody who hasn't read the climax of the story, they face pretty much mortal danger. And that can bring people together when they have such an emotional experience, especially one like that. That I hope that helped cement their bond, the way that the boatman was also trying to give them some space and let them bond.
I really appreciate that comment about my geospatial my geospatial observation, because I'm a GIS analyst. Nice one, Krishna Goli.
All right, so Rishi's going to read to us from her story. And if you didn't change to the part that you told me you were going to read, I can introduce it a little bit. Is that the part you're going to read?
Oh, it's the same part, Amy. Yeah.
Great. So this is such a lovely part. It's where Shankar brings the first bird that he finds to Angel Memorial and meets Dr. Cresswell.
So I wasn't going, that wasn't the.
Oh, that wasn't it. Okay, then I don't know what you're going to read, so surprise us.
Well, what I was going to read was a parallel to Chandree's piece, like with the couples.
Mhm.
I wonder if we got our page numbers mixed up.
It's possible. I was going from
I can read that part if you'd
book.
like. Oh, okay. It was from there. Okay. I could read. I was going to read from the old 2013 booklet.
Great, do it.
So
Actually,
is that
but
okay?
Rishi,
Should I go
could
ahead?
you tell everyone it's part of the book of collected? I read it from my library.
It's part. It was from the collection that Amy just held up. Yeah.
So if anyone wants to put a hold on this, I will return it tomorrow, I promise.
Amy, you're making me feel like I should read that part.
Read whatever you like, really.
Okay. I was going to read a part about the couples instead of the birds. But,
That's fine. Yeah.
okay.
It's all good.
So Okay, so this story is it's a story between two brothers named Prakash and Shenker, and they are both married. And Prakash has lived in the United States for longer, and he's very wealthy. He's a cardiologist. He's been settled for a while. And Shenker, who is actually his older brother, came to the United States later, and they live in Boston together in the same home with their wives, like as a joint family in the old-fashioned way. But Shenker has never been able to hold down a job. He's never been able to sort of pull himself together and accomplish everything that his brother has. So at some point, Prakash gets sick of having them in his home, and he turns them out, which is against all sorts of traditional values. So Shenker goes out looking for a job, and he finds himself in the unemployment line in an office near Boston Common. And while he's walking around this area, he thinks about his brother and wonders about what he had done to his brother to deserve this. So the other piece here is that Shenker's very loving wife, who's been referred to before, is named Neha. And so she appears in this piece too. So we're in Shenker's head in the beginning of this piece, walking around the common. Okay. Did Prakash finally hate him? Shenker's mind stretched back to the long list of complaints that his brother had against him. They had not been truly friendly since they were boys, since their father died. Prakash had almost given up his medical education for Shenker, the older brother who could not focus on his studies. Their mother had said there was not enough money for them both to be in school. And Prakash could not marry the first girl whom he had chosen because Shenker, unemployed even then, wasn't married yet. And tradition dictated that the older brother marry first. Their mother had always followed tradition. Perhaps Prakash was right. Their mother always loved Shenker best. When the sunshine no longer filtered through the willow trees, he asked a passerby what time it was. He jumped up to catch the subway to Harvard Square and then a bus to Arlington. Neha was waiting for him, watching TV. He could smell their dinner on the stove. "I am sorry," he said. "I did not realize the time. It is the changing light. The days are so long now." She got up and placed the rice and dal on the table. He put his hand on her shoulder, but she did not look at him. "Are you angry with me?" he asked in Telugu. "No," she smiled. "The computers were down at the unemployment office," he said, "so I did not file the unemployment claim. I did not find any work either." He was glad to speak to her openly. "Everything will happen at the right time," she said. She served him before serving herself, rice and lentils and mango pickle, a modest meal prepared in a kitchen not yet fully stocked. They sat at the small table, not looking at each other, but feeling that they were close. It was at times like this when Shenker felt that he had failed to provide Neha with the life she had deserved, that he remembered the first time he saw her. It was at a temple in the outskirts of Hyderabad, when she rang the bell after her prayers. He was sitting, as he often did, on the low marble wall of the temple. Sometimes he would spend a whole day like that, observing people who walked past. He was at first struck by her beauty, which perhaps only he could see. She was dark-skinned and only 5 feet tall. But her eyes were gentle and lively, and above all, kind, like those of the cows that wandered near the temple gate. She had brought a bag of sweets, which she gave to the children of the beggars sitting on the ground outside the wall. He put his hand on hers as it lay in her lap. When Neha finally spoke, it was in a low voice. "I have taken a job," she said softly. Shenker took his hand away. She stopped eating and leaned back in her chair, looking at him intently. Perhaps she was searching for hidden displeasure, but he had none for her. Was this not caused by his own deficiency? "It is filling bags at the grocery," she said. She reached for him under the table. Shenker clasped her hand again and squeezed it very tight so he would not lose her. Lying in bed that night, he remembered something that had happened in his youth, a foolish act. He was walking in the jungle with his brother when he saw two lovebirds on the branch of a tree, cooing and muzzling in the shade. Because Prakash urged him to, there was no explanation for it other than that. Shenker aimed his sling and shot at them and gave a yelp when one of the birds fell to the ground. Shenker was a religious man, and in his heart, he feared that fate would visit the same destiny on him. He had not known that lovebirds mate for life. I'll stop there. Anyway, I thought that was a good parallel to your piece, Chandreyee.
It's devastating, Rishi. Oh,
Mhm.
it's so poignant, that scene. Oh my goodness. Especially the reaching under the table. They're by themselves. But it's so symbolic of how they're both just thrumming with this fear that they share, but there are two entirely different fears. She's scared that she's going to hurt his masculinity in some way. Maybe he's going to feel less of a man because she's gotten a job before him where she's earning money, and he's being visited by this awful ghost from his past. It's wonderful. I think it says so much between the lines.
I feel like I did not know how I was going to incorporate all of the wildlife into this piece, Chandreyee. So, that's why I had asked you that question about what did the wildlife mean in your piece, So anyway, and as you know, I also work in the environmental field, so that has meaning for me too. So, anyway.
Especially for those who will read Rishi's story, or if you already has, there's a major environmental statement built in with the tower kills, the birds flying into the tall buildings, right?
Yes, for sure. So that came from that was a real that came from a newspaper article of a nonprofit called FLAP in Toronto, where people were actually being trained by folks to go out and pick up the birds that had flown during their migration into the buildings that had their lights on, and they were being disoriented by the lights that were on overnight. So during their migration, they were flying into these tall skyscrapers and landing on the sidewalks in the city of Toronto. And I read that newspaper story, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal.
Mhm.
And I ended up calling up that journalist because I was so taken with the phenomenon and the fact that this man was training folks to, how you go in and save these birds and bring them to, to medical care, and how you package them in a like a lunch bag, those old lunch bags we used to use that were made of paper so that the birds would stay calm until, you were able to take them in for medical care. So anyway, that's how that piece came about, that intersection with wildlife and nature.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a parallel in both of our stories. I had something more to say about the marriage, but I didn't know if Amy, did you have a question for Rishi? We're kind of holding our own little conversation here.
No, that's great. I'm happy for you guys to keep going. I was going to segue into talking about craft, since you were talking about how you did some research and sort of got the inspiration for that part of the story. But Chandreyee, if you wanted to finish out your thought.
Well, I think maybe I've already said it, that the two, this also really struck me, the part that Rishi read, that it was such a poignant, similar to the first part that I quoted, where she said that you scare me sometimes. To me, this was so poignant that they have, on the one hand, it's the many layers of communication all over again, just like Shutapa and Shekhar, with them jumping to conclusions with each other, with both of them feeling their mutual attraction, their mutual need to connect, but not being able to reach across and do it. This was a beautiful look at the flip side, when you've been together for a long time, and the beautiful memory he has of when he first saw her, and with that fear that he had that, the whole karma, the fear that karma will visit him. He killed a bird and something might happen. But the way that Rishi showed it, right? Like, you could have written 3 paragraphs and spelt it out the way I did it. But just by showing them reaching for each other underneath the table, feeling that fear, I think that shows that yeah, these communication problems can haunt you at any phase in life. And just the value of it, the primacy of constantly trying, just because, like, who knows where Shutapa and Shekhar are today? What happened to them 10, 15 years after? I'm not sure that this fixed, I mean, the story ends on a nice note that has some promise. Who knows? I think Rishi's story could very well be them in 10 years. It's never over, right?
Interesting. Yeah. And there's a lovely comment from Malavika. I like how in both stories it is nature. So the tiger, which we haven't talked about yet, and the birds, that leads to a sense of self-realization for the characters.
So true.
So Rishi, you were talking about doing research into the newspaper article, and I think both of you have written full-length novels, right? And maybe you want to talk a little bit about how writing a novel is different than writing a short story.
I'm gonna let Rishi take that one because I have not yet written a novel. I just write short stories, but I would love to hear from Rishi.
It was so these short stories were written in the 2000s, and the book was published in 2007. And the novel that I worked on subsequently, I took a really long time. It's a historical novel based in Southern California in the 1910s and 20s, and it's based on the first South Asians who came to the United States, and sort of the great number of obstacles they had to surmount in order to live in the United States in those years, and how they entered the economy as farmers and as folks who labored in the railroads as well as the lumber mills, and that they didn't have any of their women come with them. And because of the social structure in the United States at that time, they found a lot of Mexican women in California, at least socially available to them, and they were able to interact with them. So the marriages were often between these two groups, these South Asian men and these Mexican women. It required a great amount of research to do that. So the writing of the novel was so different from the short stories, which were really from personal experience, like a friend's friend or a relative, or anywhere that I could pull from in my everyday childhood life, made their way into the short stories. But the novel was something that I feel like I had to reconstruct this world purely from research. I went out to Southern California several times and read, was diving through these old newspaper articles and museums and, boxes at the Bancroft Library, at UC Berkeley, and at Stanford. So it was a very different exercise for me in that way, in terms of what the story was based from. And then additionally, the longer form was something that I felt like I really had to work to master. The short stories in the collection that you held up, Amy, there's 7 stories in there, and they are each they are each from a different perspective, where I was trying to play with, hey, can I write in a first person narrative of an elderly gentleman who's a judge? Can I write from the perspective of a teenage boy? Can I write from the perspective of a middle-aged woman? And I was trying to teach myself and free myself and feel like I had the confidence in my imagination to do that. And I think in some way it was preparation for this story, for the novel, which had been in my mind for decades, where I had to write about these Punjabi men 100 years ago, or I had to write about Mexican women when I'm not Mexican, or I had to write about the Japanese neighbors, and the friendship between these Japanese neighbors. So it was a very different, and I think it was a difficult experience to get it out. But I do feel like after this novel, I feel like, wow, I can tackle anything now, so anyway.
So I have to say I'm reading it right now, and it's fascinating. I was telling Rishi before that I think I want my son's high school teacher to maybe even offer it so that kids get a perspective about how this country was built, and not just the stories that are told really often, but even these hidden ones. One of the things that I find, well, actually, a question for Rishi is, you already kind of answered it, where you said that when you write a short story, your imagination takes flight in unknown directions, and you can give it free rein. Not so with a historical fiction, right? You have to keep the train on the tracks. At what point do you let your imagination free to, I'm reading the book right now, and I'm like I'm 3/4 of the way through it. The characters are not one-dimensional, even though they're set in a part of history where events are unfolding through their lives. They're so distinct. Their mannerisms are so distinct. Their personalities are so distinct. There's so much subtext, specifically where the Punjabi farmers interact with the white sheriff or the Japanese landholder, or no, the Japanese neighbor, and the landholder I think is Swedish or something, right?
He's Swiss.
Swiss.
So all of those,
Sorry.
so all of those were, you know, real. That was really the dynamic that existed. And I interviewed a number of the children of those families. A lot of them are quite elderly now, but at the time that I was interviewing them in, you know, the late 90s and the 2000s, you know, they were relating stories to me about their parents and how their parents came to this country. You know, the piece about a short story is it's highly structured. You know, it's almost like every word holds a lot of weight and counts. And I do feel, you know, the way that I relate to a short story is I feel a little more like, this is where the waist is, and this is where, you know, there's a lot of structure to it. Or if like you're building a house, okay, this is where the front door is, you know, that type of thing. But it was really messy. The novel was really messy in that way. Weirdly, the fact that it was so based on things that really happened, you know, so many of the incidents in there happened in some form. And I felt a little bit like I was in jail. It was the tyranny of the truth.
Yeah.
And I felt the weight of the fact that because the story hadn't been told in fiction yet. I mean, there's a lot of sociological studies now in the last decade about that population. It was a little known. And so I did feel the weight of like, oh, this is the first time their story is being told in fiction. I better really stick to the truth, because it was almost a political act to stick to the truth. Like, this is how it happened. And by the way, if you guys doubt it, if you readers doubt it, like, here's the newspaper article where I got, you know, the first draft of history was in this newspaper article. And so I felt a real allegiance to telling the truth. So it became a game more of like, how am I going to fit these real facts into what I think of as the structure of a tale or a story? So it was a little bit different.
Well, then I'm even more impressed with how vibrant the characters are, because they feel, it doesn't feel like you're telling us something out of the history books. Each personality is very distinct. I feel for them. I feel the weight of history pressing down on each person, because each one of them has baggage, and you see them trying to handle their pasts, their futures, trying to reconcile the needs of their family back in India, their loves, their desires, their dueling identities. And it's all done with a lot of empathy, where they don't feel flat. They're full-bodied people to me. So I think that's extremely well done.
Well, Chandreyee, you know, in your storytelling, like in all of the different facets of storytelling that you do you feel like you reach for that, the multi-dimensional character, even though it's a short rendition? I mean,
yeah, well, the advantage of storytelling is it's always first person. So it's always happened to me.
I see.
So it's pretty easy to do. I do look for subtext. I think that's the one thing that, if I had to talk about anything that I don't strive towards it, but I like that about my style, and I'm trying to nurture it, is I don't like to spell everything out. I'd like my reader to come out with their own conclusions and their own feelings. It's like the excerpt you read where Shankar reaches under the table for her hand. There's a lot packed into that. You could have just said he hugged her from behind and said, I'm so sorry that I let you down. But you didn't say that. That gesture of him reaching under the table leaves me with so much more emotion that I can feel when you're not telling me what to feel. I'm able to read between the lines and say, he's so embarrassed, it's hard for him to maybe even reach to openly communicate. He's just like underneath the table. Or is it she that reaches out? I forget.
I
It's
think, I think he tries to,
he tries
yeah,
to.
he's
Yeah.
like, he pulls away from her because, he feels a bit humiliated, as you said.
Right,
And then,
right.
comes
So
back.
to me, that's the part that I think is for storytelling too. That's the one thing in common between storytelling, which is nonfiction, personal narrative, and I've only written short stories so far. Is it's important to me to even make myself not like three-dimensional when I'm communicating my story, but I'd like to not spell it out or beat people over the head with it. And I think that's kind of meets the question I had to you about imagination, that you're right, the tyranny of the truth left you with no artistic license to fudge around with the arc or the setting or any of those things. But where I feel you probably did really kind of relax and flex your muscles was these characteristics that you imbued your characters with. Like what made the person with the A, the main person who came from Washington, his,
Ram,
I don't even know how to pronounce his name. How do you say it?
it's Ram, is the
No,
person I
not
think,
Ram, the other person.
Jeevan.
No, not Ram or Jeevan. I'm sorry. I'm getting the names mixed up. But the gentleman so Ram maybe. There's just so much warring in his head, like that he's trying to not be traumatized by what just happened to him. The act of racial hatred that he's just coming out from. He's trying to reconcile with this person that he met. I mean, I don't want to go too much into the story, but instead of telling me outright that all this is happening, you do it by showing how tense he is, how he tends to clam up, how he watches every word that comes out of his mouth. And to me, that is really good writing because it lets me feel it
Thanks,
instead of
Chandreyee.
telling me. And it's the same with storytelling. I don't want to tell people, oh, and then I was so sad I went home and I cried. I want to show them that I didn't eat my food or something and let them decide. So I think that's the only part that overlaps between those two worlds. And the idea of arc, the idea of having working up to a point in my story and then leaving people with a realization, which is that must be very hard in a novel length book. It's easier to track in a novel, in a short story. Like you said, where's the front door? Where's the back door? And how do you get from one to the other? Right?
I think so. Yeah. I think you should write a novel, Chandreyee. I think you would be a natural at it.
Gosh, thank you. We'll see. I'm having too much fun with short stories. I'm actually doing this really fun daily flash. Actually, my friend Malavika, who just commented, she introduced me to a daily flash group where this is just amazing. Every day we're fed a prompt and we have to write a story every day in 12 minutes or 350 words, whichever comes first. And it's just
That's great.
marvelous.
That's a really great. That really takes it. It doesn't allow you it doesn't allow you to be hindered by perfection, just like
Yeah.
do it. Yeah.
So I've run 2 flash fiction groups in the past myself, and it wasn't 12 minutes, I had 20-minute limits. But I've even through COVID, I had a flash fiction group where we met on Zoom every single Tuesday for almost 8 months. And somebody would throw out a prompt, we'd keep our cameras on like this. And then one person would turn on a timer and we'd all type for 20 minutes. And then boom, we would read out loud to each other. So there was no escaping. It didn't matter what you wrote. And it was just so cathartic. And so you don't get to second guess yourself. You don't get to say, I don't like that sentence. Let me rewrite it. You don't have time. And
Right.
without knowing it, we all are the art of storytelling is part of every single persona. I strongly believe in this. And it's just that when the pressure is on, sometimes it's easier for that to come out. So, but I would like to, I'm starting to feel like I've been doing so much timed pressure writing short story. I've been doing microfiction a lot. that it's time to see what it feels like to do the longer length. So I love the question you asked, Amy. What is the difference between a short story and a longer length novel? It sounds like a whole other skill set.
And I was thinking about, November is National Novel Writing Month, and we might have some NaNoWriMo participants among our listeners here. And so thank you for sharing your thoughts about the writing process. And I was wondering too, Rishi, if the fact that you chose a historical fiction as a genre maybe contributed to part of the difficulty in transitioning. Like if your full-length novel, the first full-length novel that you tried to write had been contemporary and you could draw more on your own experience, if that might have been a slightly easier transition.
I totally agree. I think it would have been. And yet I feel like the novel was one of the reasons that I even started the entire, I had held it in my mind for so long as something I wanted to do. I almost couldn't not do it next, But now, of course, I'm super sick of the entire thing. And what I'm working on is something here and now. Like it was based on something that happened yesterday.
Are you working on something now, Rishi?
I am. I'm in the very, very beginning stages. And truly, it's like on something that happened yesterday. I mean, it could have, So
That's exciting.
So I want to invite people if they have questions. I don't think we have had any questions yet for Rishi's story or for both stories or just anything people want to say. I'm going to put the link to our survey again in the chat so people can grab it.
And it's so great when people like just ask their questions like out loud. But,
yeah, also that. Or comments are also.
Yes, anything. Yeah.
We're happy to keep chatting. I have 100 questions for Rishi.
Yeah, if you guys want to keep going.
So that was another thing that I was wondering about. Now that I've read Karma and I'm reading Passage West, which is the story about the Punjabi sharecroppers in California. And the one thing that I found in common with both that just resonates with me because I am an immigrant and I find some of the short stories I write reflect that experience is in the story that Rishi read the excerpt from. There's like she doesn't exactly explain. No, actually, you do explain in detail what happens. But Shankar used to work at a convenience store, and there was an incident of racial profiling, right? Like somebody got mad at him, but it was a misunderstanding. But it was a place where he felt discomfited by his ethnicity, right? And he felt, especially because he was not as assimilated maybe as his brother, who was a successful doctor. And a similar kind of thing is actually there's multiple themes like that in Passage West, starting from the racial incident that sends Ram from Seattle to what is the name of the city, the area
In Imperial Valley.
Imperial Valley.
Yeah.
There's that. Then there's a couple of very touching scenes. There's one where he goes gambling at a casino with his earnings and someone just gets mad because he's won. And the local white sheriff, who's actually on their side, oh, that's a really good question. They step in. And I just, both those themes resonated so strongly with me. And I appreciated them because they weren't like, it's a bit of a trope now writing about, alienation of immigrants. Myself as an immigrant, I've read enough of that. I'm full of it. I'm satisfied. My appetite has had enough, but I really appreciated the way that you talked about the missteps of cultural assimilation or feeling excluded or inherent bias, but through the medium of sketching for us what a regular life can be like. This guy was just trying to do his job at a convenience store, and look at the ripple effects of that. So do you find immigrant themes visiting you often in your writing? Or is it something you fight that, no, I don't want to write about this?
I can't fight it because that's who I am. So I don't, one way when I used to really talk about, in the years when the collection came out shortly afterwards, and it was 2007, it was early on, it was always classified as immigrant fiction. I really battled with that classification because in some ways it's not immigrant fiction at all. Like the story I just read from is about a story of two brothers, the tension between two brothers, or it's there. All of those stories are oriented around family. And there's a lot of generational tension, which we find in human life all the time. You could choose to characterize those stories as like, that's a Cain and Abel type of story, or that's a mother-daughter battle, or, there's only, I don't know, 9 or 10 stories that have ever been written in the history of the world. And we just keep writing them over and over again. So I don't think I can write, and that's what I bring to that's who I bring to the page. So you can only write from that.
No, I agree. And that's why I like Karma so much, is my main takeaway was not that it was a story about immigrants, even though Shankar's catalytic moment was the incident at the convenience store, but it ended up being about it. My biggest takeaway was the birds. He set about rescuing birds. Not just that, but he found salvation for himself on 2 different planes by doing it. One, he found employment. Secondly, that guilt that had been haunting him, he maybe was kind of absolving himself of that. And in that process, now again, because I'm like you, I cannot not wear my immigrant lenses. To me, it was absolution of that too. Yes, damn it, I am an immigrant. And you know what? I did get into trouble because of my accent or whatever, but I have made a place for myself and I'm okay. And that's what I meant about not beating me over the head with it. I'm a little tired of the tropish immigrant writing, and this was the opposite of that. So I would have been very upset if that was characterized as immigrant writing too. And I really like the subtlety of it. But yeah, thank you.
I would add a third thing that changes his life with the birds is that he connects with the vet, and the vet encourages him. I mean, he not only gives him a job, but he also encourages him to follow his dream. And you see near the end of the story that he's exploring the small business option and pursuing his dream of becoming a chef.
Yeah, I mean, this is the other piece about him, is I feel like it's that thing where somebody finally finds themselves, to leave that piece of family that's holding you back, like, or the way that you've always believed what people said about you, or the way that you were constructed by external perspectives and visions. And, the story is about him becoming who he can be, through sloughing off. Instead of his brother turning him out of his house, he's like turned his brother out of his psyche,
right?
So that he could become who he, a place of greater freedom. There was a new message here that I think was it the one you just were talking about, Chandreyee? Oh yes.
I think there was another one about backgrounds and culture. How does your background influence the kinds of stories you write and the characters you create? You kind of went there a little bit. I think, there's one before that too. What kind of challenges or merits did you, Rishi, experience in shifting to writing historical fiction? You might have gone there a little bit too.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that some of the challenges were definitely around getting the facts right, because I felt a great deal of responsibility about it, like I was saying. And some writers, I think, feel like they can play fast and loose with it, which I hope maybe if I take up historical fiction again, maybe I will feel like that, but I couldn't do that in this book, in particular. But it was very, also, when you talk about the merits of it, I felt it was very satisfying to be hooked into the sense of history. There's something magical about it, to feel like you can, the time that you're writing about doesn't really exist now. You can walk through those same spaces and the same streets. But it's almost, there's something very eerie about it. There were certain times that when I was writing that book, I would pick up my iPhone and check something on the calendar, and I would be flicking scrolling backwards in time. And I'd have this like weird feeling in my head of like, oh my God, it's 1939. No, it's 1921. I feel like that's all it is. Like, what if I looked up and it really was that? There is this real feeling of how many people have walked, here I am sitting in Cambridge, how many people have walked these same sidewalks, the one in front of my home, through the eras and had their own like heartache as they walked on that sidewalk. This is the magic of writing historical fiction, I think, that we don't have when you're writing in the contemporary world, like that feeling of how far we go back, how many layers there are, or how many people have lived in this home that I'm sitting in right now and what their stories were. So I think that's what's really cool about the historical piece.
And I just want to make sure you guys saw the lovely comment. Very interesting conversation. We are all immigrants in the world.
Yeah, that is really nice.
I have to say, I feel incredibly grateful that my story, my One City, One Story, Dumba Chora, I'm so grateful that has reached such a wide audience. I haven't published a book yet, but the fact that so many people are reading about a whole different country, all these cultural questions. And I was also very careful to not write a trope-ish story where it was about a stereotype. And I tried really hard to show the ambiguity and how nothing is what it seems like. And it's just been a real honor for me.
Chandreyee, it's so lovely to have had that story chosen for One City, One Story, especially in a year when we needed that escape to a beautiful landscape and to like think of love in a different way, how we connect with people in a different way. It was just such a perfect choice.
Thank you. I do feel very grateful about that. And actually, any listeners, if you're interested, well, first of all, I'd love to hear from people. Would it be okay to share my website with them, Amy?
Yes, please. It's also in the calendar description on our website, but please
one
put
of
it
the
in the
things-
chat.
Sure. Over there, one of the things is if you follow the link for the One City, One Story, I have a page on it, but you can see the original photographs because Dumba Chora actually is a real place. And the events that start this story really happened. And I have photos on my website of the event taking place. It never starts like this, but this is almost historical fiction. The fiction's a little heavier than the history part here, but the premise is exactly true. I cannot credit my imagination for it. My cousin Hoymonti Banerjee and her husband Amitabh Banerjee were traveling in the Sundarbans when their boat got stuck. You know it, on Dumba Chora, which is a sandbar, a notorious sandbar where people have also gotten stuck when the tide goes out if you didn't time it just right. And they had a boatman whose name was not Rahman, like in my story. I don't know what his name was. They don't even remember. And my cousin actually had to cook dinner or she didn't have to, but she chose to. I even have a picture of her cooking dinner. In my story, Rahman does it. So it was wonderful to have, art follow reality. And then, of course, the people I'm writing about have got nothing to do with them. It's completely my own thing. But it was really such a joy to base it off of something that really happened. And I was also really inspired by Amitav Ghosh, who's a very famous writer. His book, Hungry Tide, The Hungry Tide, is set in that area. It's a fantastic read. And he's actually got another book that's just come out called Jungle Nama that's about the Sundarbans area. And he's a real activist who works for climate change
and conservation, right?
And conservation.
Yeah.
I attended a talk that he was at in Iowa, Indiana last week. He's so knowledgeable. And so I've added a couple of links on my website I actually know the director of the Sundarban project who works for the World Wildlife Fund in the Sundarban. He's a good friend of mine. So I asked him to send me a link where if people want to help out, that links on my website too. That area has just been devastated. The people are poor and they work on a subsistence level anyway. It's such a harsh environment. It's beautiful when you go there on a holiday, on a little boat trip, and you come back. But the because of climate change and because of frequency of storms and high tide events, it's all saline. Like the water it's just estuarines. Fresh water comes in when it's low tide, and when it's high tide, the sea wants to come in. And they have these big embankments, berms that they make around the islands to keep the salt water out so they can grow crops. One bad storm that sends salt water into their fields kills it for 10 years. So now agriculture is gone. They step into the water because the area's got a lot of wonderful fishing, shrimping, crabbing. Not only are there alligators in the water, there's also these special kind of sharks called camotes that just kind of, they'll eat parts of you and you won't even realize it's missing. I remember it used to be in the newspapers all the time when I was a teenager. Like, a kid's gone shrimping, they come out, they're missing a hand because they have some kind of anesthetic that they do so you don't even realize. And they've taken you. And on land where people go to collect honey, there's tigers, and the tigers can swim. Wonderful. So they have all of that, and then the pandemic came through to wipe out what little there was. So it's a beautiful area with a very tortured history, with incredible challenges raging, and it all connects. Like, we're all so connected, right? So much of it has to do with population, with climate change. So much of it has to do with the geopolitics of displacing people. A lot of the population from Sundarbans comes from people who were marginalized in other parts of India, who were landless, who at the time of partition, when the British left, they ran seeking land. Not so different from the people in Passage West, who just were trying to chase a future for their kids to keep their families alive. So it's a haunting area. I'm so grateful that people are finding out about it. I really hope people will read more about the area, and find out. So Rishi and I both, this is where we come from. We spent our careers working for conservation. So this is my first story that's reached such a wide audience, and I'm just so overjoyed that it's my twin passions of conservation and culture and communication.
And literature.
And of course, literature.
Thank you both so much. I'll leave a couple more seconds for any last questions, if there are any. But you actually just reminded me, Chandreyee, that we didn't talk about caste and caste bias that appears in your story. If you want to talk about that a little.
Sure. That's just something I alluded to again. Like I was saying, I didn't want to get didactic in one short story and, go into everything about everything. But the illusion there is when Shudapa talks about Manoj Bagchi, her boyfriend who couldn't stand up, but couldn't fight for their relationship. That's because even now in India, because casteism is alive and well. And what that means is in Hinduism, I don't pretend to understand it or very well, but I come from a conservative family. And if you're a Brahmin, I come from a Brahmin family. If you're a Brahmin, then you're not supposed to marry a non-Brahmin. They even have levels of Brahminism within themselves. And it's a big deal for an arranged marriage. My father was a very staunch Brahmin, and in his ideal world, my brother and I would have married people of exactly the same caste. I think I did end up marrying someone of the same caste. My brother did not. He didn't even marry someone from Bengal. He married someone from a different state in India, which is a big deal. And my family showed their true colors by really not giving a damn. They were really happy, which shocked me because I've always heard about caste bias in our family, a long line of blue-blooded whatever, and I just despise it. So it was eye-opening to me, but it does thrive in many conservative pockets, not because people are openly bigots or horrible or evil, but because it's what they've known, right? And it's like it's just parents trying to think about what's best for their kids or something like that. But that was my illusion, that Shutapa and her boyfriend, who are this modern couple, it's again that push and pull between modernity and the forces of culture that have us pulled in both ways, more so in Indian culture possibly than in modern American culture, because many Indians still live in joint families, much fewer than before, where a joint family is where you don't just live with your parents, but you live with your uncles and your aunts and your grandfather. I came from a joint family. My whole family lived together in basically 2 apartments in a building. And even though we haven't had a joint family in a few decades, the thinking is shaped by that. It's community living. It's like the whole Ubuntu idea that they talk about in some African cultures, that it's not an individualistic society. The decisions you make are not the decisions that make you happy. It has to do with what serves your extended family, which is your community. So I didn't want to go into all of that, but the fact that Shutapa's boyfriend could not fight for their marriage, I've talked about this at other panels related to One City, One Story I've been doing. A lot of people have asked me about caste bias, and I've gone into some length to say that it is terrible, but it's not. Just like with arranged marriage, everything isn't the way it seems, especially to the West, where we're not familiar with the culture, that it's not just about people being bigots. It's about people trying to do the right thing and balancing their needs of family. And in my story, you see the fallout. You see that Shutapa and Manoj lost each other. Turned out well for Shutapa because she fell in love with another man, and hopefully they'll have figured it out after that horrible night on the boat, and hopefully they're happy.
Yes, I was going to say also the pictures are quite striking. So if you haven't had a chance yet, please do check out the website and take a look.
I'll put it in here too.
Oh, yes. And Rishi, if you want to put your website in the chat as well.
Thanks, Naomi.
And thank you both so much. This was wonderful. And thanks everyone for coming. If you want to grab the link to either website or to our feedback survey, do that before we close out the Zoom session. It will go
So
away.
and will this recording be available so I can put it on my website?
Yes. I don't think the chat stuff shows up, but the recording will be.
Sure.
I should be able to email that out tomorrow, I hope.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Amy. It was so nice to be here, and thank you to Belmont Library for hosting us. It was really, I love doing the small venues and talking to folks who are actually reading the books. It's really, really nice, especially in this era where over the past year, you know, writers had very little to do with their readers, and it was a real loss. I missed everyone.
Yeah.
This was wonderful. It's like being in somebody's living room with 2 fantastic writers. I just am eating this all up. So thank you all.
Oh, thank you, Catherine.
Thank you. That's so lovely. Thank you for telling us that. It's really lovely to hear that.
And I think one of the benefits of Zoom is that you can really pull people from far and wide. So you don't have to even live in the time zone. You can
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Amy. This was lovely chatting, and I'm so grateful that Rishi could be here too. It's always inspiring to hear from writers who are so talented.
Yes.
Thanks, Chandreyee. It's great to be talking with you. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Good night.
Take care, everyone.